should establish a system of unique biometric identification for all citizens. This is a policy resolution indicated by an actor doing an action, obviously, so you should evaluate it through net benefits. In terms of definitions, we believe they're all contextual, except for unique biometric identification, which is like a tricky term. Basically, it's a means by which a person can be uniquely identified, as in only they match these traits, by evaluating one or more distinguishing biological traits, like DNA. For background, Argentina, Belgium, Colombia, Germany, Italy, Peru, and Spain all have these systems, according to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, so it's pretty widely used, yeah.
What's the difference between unique biometric identification and just biometric?
Yeah, so just regular biometric identification may be things that don't specifically pinpoint one person as being like the target of whatever you're trying to identify. So unique biometric identification is unique in that you are the only person that could be identified with that. So that's why it's unique. Let's move on to the plan. The United States federal government should establish an STR DNA ID system for all U.S. citizens. To repeat, the United States federal government should establish an STR DNA ID system for all U.S. citizens. This would happen by normal ways and means. To explain like what that means, it's kind of complicated. STR is short, tandem, repeat. It's basically the scientific name for the process that takes DNA sections that identify who you are using parts of your DNA that are otherwise worthless or non-identifying. This info doesn't determine your race, background, etc. It just tells you who you are genetically. So basically, it takes information that otherwise does not have a function, and it uses that to identify you. If you took this information by itself, you could not determine like the race of somebody, for instance. Yeah.
What's the error rate?
Sorry?
The error rate.
The error rate? I'm not sure what that
Error
was.
rate.
Yeah,
Oh,
sorry,
error
I'm
rate.
tired.
Sorry. The error rate, we don't know a specific error rate. It's, well, yeah, really low, since it's like uniquely identifying, like literally it has to be uniquely identifying. What is this even? So moving on to the arguments. The first advantage is that of identity ambiguity and identity theft. Right now we see a couple problems. First of all, identity theft is a major issue in the United States. In 2017, 6.6% of consumers became victims of identity theft. 16.7 million people, and this is just increasing from previous years according to crime statistics. Secondly, this is because identities can be fabricated when there is no standard biological way to prove who you are or aren't, and all other systems can be bypassed. The plan solves this issue of identity theft, not right now. One, it makes it physically and biologically impossible to disguise yourself as someone else. Unless you have their exact DNA, which is impossible because it takes sections of DNA that nobody else has. Thus, it is biologically impossible to replicate the same DNA because of all of the factors that the plan uses, which are completely genetically unique. Secondly, it sends a perception and creates a deterrence effect. Obviously, if a criminal trying to commit identity theft knows that they're going to be immediately spotted and that this identity theft is not going to properly function, it prevents criminals from even wanting to steal identities in the first place. Identity theft is devastating for many reasons. First of all, is probably most importantly and most relevant, financially, identity theft is devastating. You could have unauthorized purchases, ruin your credit history, be denied loans, mortgages, and employment, and lose the ability to open a bank account, according to the FTC, all because of identity theft. These are things that are vital to surviving in the United States in the modern world, like being able to spend money, for instance, and being able to have a bank account where you can put all of your funds. And these are things that are incredibly important. Without them, somebody would have significant drops in quality of life and not really be able to function in the United States. Yeah.
So, would your plan have this DNA ID system replace all of the current methods of identification, or how much would it replace?
Yeah, so we're going to explain in the second argument how current identification processes are costly and basically ineffective in comparison. So yeah, it's implied that it's a replacement. Second is, it's a supplement. So it's going to be the main way of identification. So Secondly, medically, people can be denied treatments, they can be denied prescriptions, because simply if your identity is stolen, you're probably not going to be trusted because there's somebody else who could be fraudulently trying to get like these prescriptions or these treatments, and that's especially such a big issue when there are people who are just trying to get prescription drugs like opiates to like supplement their own addictions. Which means that basically not only will you have huge financial ruin because of identity theft, but you could also be denied these treatments and prescriptions which literally could save your life. And without them, you would not have access. So the second argument is efficiency. So right now we see, first of all, the US spends a significant amount of money on Social Security, passports, passport cards, and Department of Defense identifications. This is a waste of money. Secondly, this is a complete waste of money. And third, it's still difficult, even with these systems, to actually confirm an identity. So how does the plan change that? First of all, it makes a primary, like, centralized single ID system that streamlines the ID process and is actually, like, functional, as opposed to all of these other systems which still allow for identity theft and all of these harms. And secondly, DNA ID means that you can, I don't even know what, I don't know what this.
Government has that.
Oh, sorry, yeah, DNA ID means the government knows or like has the ability to know who you are and who you say you are. Which means that this is really important because it means that the system will actually finally be efficient. So there are a couple of like actual impacts of this. First of all, it's just the straight monetary impact of having like all of this money being spent on systems or like having other primary systems which are simply not effective. That will be solved because we're streamlining it into one main system. And then secondly is the inefficiency. It still does cost a lot of money for things to like, especially like trying to prosecute identity theft and stuff like that. It costs a lot of money to actually reach a conclusion with that. By streamlining the process, you're also saving time, you're making the system more efficient, and you're also making sure that the government has the ability to catch criminals. Also there's one important thing before I end my speech, just to clarify, twins can still be distinguished by these DNA factors on the identification. I just want to clarify that. But for all these reasons, vote for the affirmative. Thank you.
If you want, you can use the chair.
Yeah, if you want to stand up.
Oh, it's fine.
Okay.
Hang it up.
That's what you guys want.
Okay, so I'm not going to be talking super fast, but the order is basically going to be frameworking order, then app case, then 3 disadvantages. Okay? Is everyone ready?
Sorry, 1 second.
Yeah, paper.
Okay.
Yep. Perfect. So with that, time starts in 3, 2, 1. My partner and I strongly negate the resolution that the United States federal government should establish a system of unique biometric identification for all citizens. First, on framework, we agree that this is a policy around and that it should be evaluated on the basis of net benefits. We also agree with their definition of a unique biometric identification, so we agree with that. In terms of background, where they talk about lots of countries having unique biometric identification, first off, they only mention around like 10 or 15 countries out of literally almost 200 countries, so it's not really that common. And we can also see that there's systemic harms in many of the countries in which these exist, which I'm going to be getting to later in the negations case. So as far as their plan, where they talk about how the United States federal government will establish an STR-DNA ID system with normal ways and means. So we agree with this, however, we'd like to make a few observations on this. First, we have to look at how the system will actually work. When we look at the precedent in, say, India for their Aadhaar system, what they do, I probably mispronounced that, apologies, what they do is that they have a card where they scan their fingerprint, they scan their iris, and I believe there's one other means of identification, which I forget off the top of my head, I want to say like photo ID. And then through that, because the error rate of all of them, individually they're relatively high, but together the error rate is significantly low. What they do then is to verify in person, they take the fingerprint, right? Because fingerprints are very easy to verify quickly. It's about, like say, a 5 or 10 second process. That's the issue with STR-DNA. STR-DNA, while it's not going through the entire genome, which could take literally days or weeks, it's still going through significant portions of the genome which have to be picked out in different spots. You need something like 30 or 40 different enzymes. It's a complicated reaction which takes hours to process. Fundamentally, this means that they're stuck in a double bind. Either it's implemented and we see everything just back up beyond belief, because if you have to wait hours to process to do anything, their whole economy basically shuts down, or it's not implemented and then they can't really solve their advantages because it's so impractical that nobody wants to use it in the first place. So, moving on to their first advantage, that of identity theft. First, they talk about how 6.6% of consumers had their identity stolen. What they don't give you here is the breakdown of this between in-person identity theft and online identity theft. Online identity theft often doesn't hinge on any form of identification at all. Rather, it hinges on things such as, say, phishing, which rely on the user's own incompetence. And we often see that online, or simply hacking on the other hand, we also see that online retailers, they often don't verify identification to begin with. So when this isn't being used, we actually can't solve a significant portion of identity theft. But furthermore, we come back to the time issue with STR, and the equipment issue with STR. When we look at verifying it online, the average person doesn't have the equipment to verify STR DNA, so retailers online simply just can't implement it. But even beyond this, if they are going to implement it, no one wants to wait 6 hours to buy a bag of gummy bears off of Amazon. No one wants to do this. So a competitor is going to pop up which isn't going to verify it, and people are going to move to that. So that just prevents solvency. In addition, what we see is that the government agencies are probably going to be forced to use this, such as the DMV, such as Customs and Border Patrol. They're going to be backed up beyond belief. I keep using beyond belief just because when we think about it in the status quo and ID check, you look at the ID, you look at the person, maybe you check the ID is fake, that's 10 or 15 seconds. STR literally takes hours to process, and there's no practical way to expedite it beyond this. So if you think the lines of the DMV are bad now, wait until you have to wait hours, not only just to be at the DMV, but to have your ID verified. Or even look at Customs and Border Patrol upon people coming to the United States. When you get back on the flight, you're going to have to wait another 5 or 6 hours to make sure you're actually who they say you are, which is because they're getting rid of most of these ancillary identification systems, where we don't have a quick way around it. We're using this system, which is just highly impractical. Also, where they talk about how the harms of identity theft. The key point here is that these harms are highly reversible, meaning that even if a person does have their identity stolen, while it will take them, say, a few weeks or months to actually take care of the harms, these harms are very easy to reverse. A person will get the money they spent back, they will get their credit score back up, it's nothing permanent in the vast majority of cases. Yes?
So what happens if somebody needs medication desperately and cannot refill a prescription or get a new prescription because their identity has been stolen and they're not trusted?
Okay, first off, in your next feature, it'd be great if you could provide a specific example of that, but also hospitals are obligated to save the lives of people without going through the whole verification of identity and insurance, so we're not going to see people dying in the streets.
Emergency rooms are mandated to treat all patients.
Emergency rooms are mandated to treat all patients. Even beyond this, STR DNA, if that's going to become the national standard, like, if we believe them, come into the hospital, you're bleeding out, oh, wait 6 hours before we give you oxycodone. Like, it's even less practical. In terms of advantage to that with efficiency, just cross-apply all the analysis I've been doing previously, because the time delaying STR DNA verification, basically just the efficiency just goes down the tubes because it takes hours to verify identification. So yes, are we sure about it? Yes, but the efficiency goes down because it takes so much longer to verify identification. On to the negations case. Our first disadvantage is that of civil liberties. What we can see is that national identification schemes can be used to deny citizens' rights We can see ultimately that the government can do things such as force them to be used to get work, to receive benefits, and other things. We can also see that the state admission of the card often involves, according to attorney Rahul Narayan in India, we can see this with India's program, it's likely to be the same slippery slope fallacy, same slippery slope thing that we see in India, according to these advocates, that we'll see in the United States, where it will evolve to purposes that we haven't even thought of yet, which ultimately are just going to be used to clamp down on civil liberties. We can ultimately see that just by increasing this bureaucracy, we're just going to restrict civil liberties, which directly comes back to harm quality of life and increase dehumanization. Yes?
So can you explain how and why a government would actually want to decrease your civil liberties?
Yeah, sure, because the fundamental question of government is trading off civil liberties for getting protection, and national biometric identification unique biometric identification, it's a great way to get protection. And ultimately, that's what government provides. A lot of time, government pushes more for protection, citizens push more for civil liberties. Government's taking away civil liberties is nothing new. If you really want more on that, my partner can give you like 5 examples in her speech, but I don't think that's a huge issue. The second disadvantage, scratch the second disadvantage. Disadvantage 3 is that of hackers. What we can see is that non-state actors, or disadvantage 2 now, we can see that there are non-state actors in black market and who sell black market information who routinely participate in hacking national identification systems. For example, we've seen that not even just considering hacking, but simply leaks, with India's national identification system, there have been 210 separate instances in about 2 years where it's been implemented, where personally identifiable information has been leaked online, putting millions of Indians with their with the information they're required to get their government online and findable with a simple Google search. We can also see, we can see that the US database of biometric information, ultimately it has to be electronic to be verifiable, because it doesn't make sense to do it in any other way. It becomes even less practical. Normal means dictate that these SDR information is going to be electronically stored along with all the personal information for people for these programs that they mentioned, such as Social Security, such as like say insurance or other stuff. It's all going to be stored electronically. And fundamentally, there's no such thing as a secure electronic system. So by putting all the information of all the people in the US, it essentially creates putting all of our eggs in one basket scenario where hackers are just going to target, their efforts at this. So ultimately what this leads to ultimately the leaking of this information. And even with SDRs, where we've seen historically that what we previously think is junk DNA or DNA where you can't actually tell anything from it, it's gotten pushed down and down and down over time. So these SDR information likely does contain something we don't know yet, and eventually that will be leaked too, leaking genetic information, harming privacy, and just leading to discrimination. For these reasons, negate. Thank you.
I'll do the off case, on case.
So neg that.
Okay, so just to clarify, off case and on case. Okay. Off case and on case.
Yeah, off case and on case.
Off case the one.
Third
How
time's
did you
the
know?
charm.
Alright. Okay, let's begin on the dissat of governmental rights and on violating rights of the people. They constantly give this example of India, and they're saying that, oh, well, in India they had this issue, so actually, yeah, I'm going to start at the top of case just because that's where they begin. Sorry about the lack of clarification. So first, on the background, they say that there's only these 15 countries are the only countries that have done this type of biometric identification. That's like not a lot of people. That actually, if we give you like 15 specific examples, that is, for this new type of technology, that is a litany of examples showing that significant bad things have not happened in these other countries. Although they do give the example of India, we are not implementing India's system at this time. So they respond to our plan. I don't really know what this is doing here. They're like observations, but they respond anyway in case it's offense. So they say that India's error rate is very high because they're combining multiple different types of biometric identification systems. I agree, India's system is probably not a good system. That's why we're not doing India's system. What our system is the S short tandem repeats is the same type of DNA analysis that is done in like criminal investigation and forensics. It's when you go to a place that you take like a swab of DNA and they identify that based on the short tandem repeats. It's just, it outputs a number, right? So this is a completely different system than, not this time, than India. India is combining like all these different, they're saying that it's combining like fingerprints and iris scanning, and that increases the error rate. Gladly, our system is not vulnerable to that. So they said So then they also put in the overview here, but they don't you shouldn't even treat it as offense because they don't put it into a disadvantage. They say that it's going to take a long time in order to process these things. They say it'll take hours to process compared to the amount of time that it takes to get other forms of ID. And a few hours is not going to change anything on the specific point of creating these pieces of ID, which is what they were talking about at that time. So this is a proven technology that is used in crime analysis commonly. So it's to resolve disputes about identity. Okay, so moving on to their disadvantage, they talk about government rights, and they talk about India, how that they will use it for things that people have we haven't discovered yet what the problems are going to be, but they're probably going to do in the future, and that the government's probably going to make people lose their civil liberties because of what they're doing. However, this is non-unique. This is going to be something that is true for any form of government identity. Because you are centralizing a system, that does not mean that the government is going to be able to do this more. Now at this time, the government already has all these pieces of identification. If they wanted to, for any particular group of people, they could combine them on their own and see, I want to target all these people. Although this is something that should be avoided, this is something that exists in both worlds, so you shouldn't be even evaluating this disadvantage, because this is something that is always going to be happening when you have any form of identification in a government where a government could be oppressive. I don't think I need to do any more work here. It's pretty clear this is non-unique. So moving on to their second point, they talk about hackers and how when you have a centralized database, that this makes it vulnerable. And non-state actors specifically. Then they talk about India being hacked 200 times. So I have a few responses to this. They assume that the DNA ID, the output of the short hand repeat process, that this is vulnerable information. It is not inherently vulnerable information. The distinction between a DNA ID and a social security number is a social security number is effectively a password that you want to keep private. And then they assume, and so that when you reveal that, then that's bad. The social security number is not the equivalent in terms of privacy to this DNA ID. It's just identifying information. And then the function through which you can confirm someone's identity is by checking back to see if that person actually corresponds to the ID to the DNA ID that it's given you.
How can you identify the STR repeats of a person on a regular basis?
On a regular basis, there are plenty of desktop machines that are being developed. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, but that's a perfect segue. There's a lot of technology that is being developed right now for desktop DNA analysis because this is becoming so common, and in the future, specifically because this plan is for the future as we specified, then because the technology is going to be developed, that the amount of time it takes for this processing to happen is going to go down. We already see that it is common in criminology, so the amount of time that it takes is only going to be going down. So then they say that, also it's non-unique. They say that, it's bad because you could be hacked. The status quo, you have government databases that can be hacked. This is still an issue. Privacy and regulations and stuff like this is something that is, again, non-unique. Their entire case is pretty much non-unique. That's going to be pretty significant. When you have no reason to vote neg, you're probably going to be risking solvency by vote, and you should be voting half. So then they say that there's probably, so they say that they're correct when they say that the short tandem repeat data is taken from junk DNA that doesn't indicate anything. And that in the future, that junk DNA might actually, they might figure out, this does mean something, and that could be used to, they're probably going to expand on this later. Don't let them do this because it's just a number. The number, it's like if you take a hash of a file, in computer science, it's not telling you any information about that file, it's just identifying information, right? So you're not going to be, that's not something that is vulnerable. Last question.
If STR is generated from nucleotide bases from junk DNA, how do you generate a number from that? And if it becomes a number, is it possible that two different STR chains will have the same number?
The only case in which you have two STR chains that have the exact same sequence is if they are twins. And Ben specifically tells you that in that case, you can differentiate between other non-STR DNA ID systems, right? That you can differentiate between twins. That's the only time when you'd have an exact match. The probability of having a match is very unlikely. I don't have all of the statistics memorized, but generally because it is so trusted in the criminal justice system, this is a non-issue. Everyone has a separate ID. Basically, there are 20 or more variables through which you can differentiate people. The probability it's approximately equivalent to a SHA hash or something. So it's not going to happen, and that has never happened before, at least to my knowledge, and unless they can bring that up. Okay, moving on to our case. So First, pretty much all of the ink they have is on the first advantage. We tells you ID. We talked to you about ID ambiguity and how that there are issues that are a result of identity theft. We tell you that when you have the capability to go back and check based on someone's biological identification what that DNA they are who they say they are, that you're going to be reducing and through two ways. One, you have the actual link, and two, the perceptual link that you'll disincentivize people from wanting to try and commit these types of crimes in the first place. The second link is the one that we're going to be going for because they really don't do enough analysis here. Although it is true that in the status quo it might take a few hours in order to evaluate this, and online, most online that it's like probably not going to be very easy to do this. The point is that if you are able to, with absolute certainty, verify someone's identity after the fact of identity theft has happened or an insecure thing has happened with regard to the identification of a person, the point that this can be 100% proven after the fact, like through prosecution or analysis or any questioning, and also with the increase of desktop appliances with where DNA can be identified, and that's increasing in the status quo, that is going to have a deterrence effect on criminals, so they're not going to want to commit these types of crimes in the first place because they know that they will be found, they know that it will not be effective, so none of these crimes will be happening. That's something that is not responded to. Don't let them respond to it later because that'd be sandbagging, and then we wouldn't be able to respond to it effectively. We should have debate at the beginning. So ID theft is still a big issue. It's non-unique that they're saying that it's not a big issue. We're telling you that if we have some solvency, that's good. Also, like extend the second point on efficiency. They just cross-apply here. I guess I'm doing that too. But still, it's really important. We talk to you about like streamlining the ID system and making it efficient for the government. These are actual advantages that they don't really talk about. Thanks.
So it's going to be an overview followed by the affirmatives, followed by the negations points.
Does the off case include top of case and like the plan arguments?
Yes, it does.
When you say overview, do you want me to flow on a separate sheet of paper? Or?
It doesn't really matter. You can honestly flow it along with like framing and stuff. It's just like a
What's
sentence.
the order again? Losing coming habit. What's the order again?
Okay, so it's going to be an overview followed by this overview is kind of just an extension of a point that was made on the framework. So overview, then framework and all the top of case stuff, then affirmative points, then negative points. Alright. Everyone ready? Alright. My time starts in 3, 2, 1, now. First, the overview. The affirmatives plan depends on a version of technology that doesn't yet exist. Let's move on to the top of case. So first, they accept all of these, definitions, and like when we talk about like background information, this is the main issue that we have contentions with here. So the first thing that they say is that error rates are high, and they agree because we said error rates are high, but we never said that these error rates for the combined Indian identification system were high. In fact, we said that they were low. So like they don't really address this point. We'd like them to address this in their next speech if possible, because we say that even like right now, current technology has already shown you that there are alternatives to the 6-hour process that are just as effective, have just as low error rates. Yes, your first are 2 POIs.
So aren't literally both of your disadvantages saying that the Indian system is bad and you should avoid it? Why are you suddenly like trying to suggest that we should use it?
We're saying that the Indian system can be flawed in some ways, but that the error rate is not one of those ways. Okay, then moving on, they talk about how there's going to be like criminal investigations and forensics is what's currently using the system, but there's 2 points to this. The first one is that these criminal investigations often take months to complete, and the second point here is that the criminal investigations right now, the use of them literally is for pinpointing criminals. So why are we setting a precedent for using a system for identifying criminals for all of our citizens? This is bad because this creates an invasive procedure, which is definitely going to be bad. But so they brought up this new thing about criminal investigation. We see that one of the reasons that they aren't used on citizens right now is because they literally require you to take samples of your saliva and your DNA, and that's why they haven't been implemented as much. Because, for example, if you have someone who's a citizen but doesn't want to be identified in this way, what's going to happen? It's a slippery slope. Are they going to be taking their DNA by force? Are they going to swab them by force? That's not good, right? Then moving on, they talk about like how we shouldn't flow through like some part of our argumentation just because it's not specifically taglined as anything. This is specifically referring to the 30 to 40 enzymes that you need to go through for this in order to go through these portions of the genome, and the number of hours, like up to 6 hours, that it takes to process. Now this, if you really want to label it, sure, label it solvency. That works. On the plan itself, so like because okay, their only refutation here on the portions of the genome is that it takes longer to create ID. But we're not specifically talking about creating the ID, we're talking about checking the ID. Because every single time that you want to be able to verify whether someone actually has the STR strands that they do, you're going to have to take a sample of DNA and go through the process. They're going to tell you that future advances in technology is going to help like decrease this amount of time, but the fact is that we don't have that technology right now. At the point where like technology can be proposed and like it doesn't deliver, as in for example Apple's Air Power project, we see that something as important as national security cannot be extended in this. But even more beyond that, when we just look at the plan itself, we see that they cannot be expected to take this to the future, because in their first speech they did not specify when the plan would take place. They did not specify a time frame. What that means is that you need to assume normal means for the time frame. Don't allow them to have the future as when they will implement their plan. Instead, it has to be as soon as possible, because that is what normal means is. And in addition, realize that because they had not yet provided a deadline for how long the future is, this is an example of shifting goalposts. This is bad because they could say, hey, the future in 10 years, the future in 20 years. But the fact that they don't specify how long the future is means that this could extend indefinitely, meaning that there's even less solvency here. Then moving on, the first point that the affirmative brings up is the point about identification theft. And so basically the first thing they say here is that you can verify this with absolute certainty, and if you can do this, then why wouldn't you? Here's the problem. When you're going online, you're not shopping for certainty. When you're using a credit card, you're not doing it out of certainty. We crave, as a society, convenience more than certainty. That's important because that's what our economy functions on. That's what credit is. It means that I'm not 100% sure that I can pay you back like right now at this very moment, but I can pay you back in the next week, and I'm asking you to trust me based on that. So what this does is when you're giving the system that like doesn't provide absolute certainty, because they admit has a percent of error, and two, doesn't necessarily address our like convenience of online shopping. If you believe them that you can only do this, then like basically if this is going to be the primary method of identification, then all online shopping just disappears. But this doesn't happen, because even today we see that online shopping is slowly taking over retail stores. Even when in retail stores you can pay with cash, which is close to 100% certainty, whereas retail stores can just sell you fake products and have fake credit cards, which is more uncertainty on either side. Therefore, you see that identification theft doesn't just happen as like a percentage of certainty. It happens as like a thing about bad actors. And so one bad actor circumstance, it doesn't even involve in-person identification, is like this example of phishing, which they don't like bring up at all, right? Another thing that they talk about how retail, like they don't really talk about how retailers can't implement it. So like extend the analysis I just made here as well. Kind of the other refutation they make here is that there's an idea of the deterrence effect, and how like criminals won't like do this. But like this ties directly into when we talk about how like once you implement this policy, it's going to extend forever basically, right? Unless you repeal it. And so people will be able to like find ways around this. And so if technology for analyzing this increases, then the technology for making fake copies for it probably increases as well. Then the most important thing here is efficiency. Even if you give them all their stuff on identification theft, they talk the like most important thing you can garner from this is like maybe medical prescriptions. But first of all, like medical prescriptions are for long-term chronic illnesses, which probably means that like any sort of like financial thing that you can do, you can probably clear up that sort of like identification theft problem within that span of time. But even if you don't believe that, look to short-term but fatal issues such as like what we were talking about earlier, like shock and what was it, allergies. Like you can literally fatally die from allergies. And so this is something that ERs are mandated to do. And so, but you can't do that in their world because they would be using this sort of ID that takes like 6 hours as their thing. And then also look to DMV and Customs and Border Control. Literally this basically just collapses our entire economy because the current way that we do things is being changed, and you can't say the future is going to have to be as soon as possible. Right after this round, all of the economy is going to stop because they haven't implemented this ridiculous policy. But then moving on to the second point that they talk about, which is about, again, efficiency, cross-apply our analysis about efficiency here. Then finally, look at our disadvantages. Our first disadvantage and most important one is that of civil liberty. So with civil liberty, basically the first thing they say is that IDs are, happen in India, but here, IDs are states right now in the United States, not federal government. So this definitely gives them more ability. Also, a second argument here is that increased amount of info collected means that you increase the amount of coverage and leverage the data the government has over us regardless. So look to, instead of having fingerprint, have fingerprint and pupil identification. So.
Is everyone ready? Okay, perfect. So, time starts, or wait, are you guys ready?
Yeah.
Okay, time starts in 3, 2, 1. If I had to pick 2 words to describe the affirmations case today, they would be convincingly misleading. What we see is that they completely try to sidestep this issue of efficiency, where they try to portray it, as my partner mentions in her speech, is that, oh, well, it still takes 6 hours to get an ID. Getting the ID isn't the issue. Verifying the ID is. Because as they mentioned in their first speech, and don't allow them to try to get around this and change this is going to become the main form of identification for the United States. Meaning that if your identity needs to be verified, this is how it will be verified. And they never really give you a good response as to how they can get around the time it takes for these chemical reactions to take place with multiple different catalysts, which are the enzymes, where in the status quo, it takes around 6 hours. And these desktop machines, they can cut some of this off, but not that much. And ultimately, this is where we're left with. We're implementing this in the present. So when we implement it in the present with technology that takes 6 hours to verify the identity of one person, we can see that key things all around the United States, such as our ports of entry through Customs and Border Patrol, such as the Department of Motor Vehicles, they're all going to grind to a halt because these institutions need to verify the ID of people that they're dealing with. And when their only option is this system to take 6 hours, they can't get anything done. This causes the United States economy to grind to a halt, which has massive negative impacts, and this is ultimately where you vote neg. But even beyond this, the unique thing that the negation doesn't create that the affirmation does is a national database of information. Obviously, when they're talking about things such as storing it with like prescriptions and other stuff, we're obviously not just storing the SDRs, we're storing it associated with certain information. And when this is all stored electronically, there's no such thing as a perfect system, there's no such thing as an unhackable system. We're creating a honeypot for hackers, essentially. We're creating this thing where we've got all the information a hacker could ever want, pretty much, and we're putting it all in one place for them. So the idea, and when we've seen that India has already had 210 leaks in about 2 years, the United States, if we don't leak this information, it will be hacked, and this puts the personal information of literally hundreds of millions of Americans out on the internet with Google search for anyone to find. This causes permanent dehumanization and decrease in quality of life for a bunch of reasons that I think everyone can get. So, moving on, so we're going down the flow a bit. When we look on the plan, the key observation here is that the plan takes place as soon as possible. When we look at normal ways and means, the plan gets done as quickly as it possibly can or as soon as possible. When they don't really spec a specific time frame, such as in the future, they don't even spec the future until their second speech. And then once they do say the future in their second speech, they're super vague about it. So go with normal ways and means, go with as soon as possible. This means that they're creating a national identification system that hinges on tomorrow's possible technology today. And ultimately, this is what collapses their plan. In terms of their first advantage, that of identity theft, we've got the issue here of just efficiency, where pretty much we come to the thing where private corporations just aren't, as I mentioned in my first speech, they're simply not going to verify it because it's going to be a pain for everyone to deal with. And those areas that do have to verify, preventing it from solving identity theft. And those corporations or government agencies that do have to verify it, they can't do it quickly, everything grinds to a halt, even more economic damage. So ultimately this contention flows neg. Same thing pretty much with their contention about efficiency, except the only issue here this time is efficiency. And when we're talking about taking the process from a 15-second check to 6 hours, it's pretty obvious efficiency flows neg here. You flow this contention to the negations. Yeah. So ultimately, when we weigh things in today's debate, what we can see is that the biggest magnitude issue is going to be that of grinding the economy to a halt. The affirmation might have some tiny solvency for identity theft, but when we look at the economic harms of that compared to grinding the economy to a halt, the negation clearly outweighs on this. But even furthermore, when we look at things such as exposing the personal information of millions of Americans, this isn't reversible. Unlike identity theft, it's also much larger magnitude. So for all these reasons, I urge a vote for negation. Thank you.
Okay. So the order is going to be it's going to be our first advantage, second advantage, our second advantage, and then our first advantage, and then the DAs. Is everyone ready? So the second advantage is no ink on it. They basically concede all of this coming out of the first speech, and as Nolan said, new responses in the rest of your speeches are sandbags, which means that either you don't buy any of the new responses they make to the second argument, or if you do think that they're true, if you do accept them, then they're sandbagging, and that's harmful to the educational value of the debate. At that point, it's a lose-lose for the negative.
Point of order, stop time. I don't believe the argument that the negation didn't respond to advantage 2 has been brought up before in today's debate, but if I'm mistaken, I apologize.
Yeah, so Nolan basically said it was conceded, and then he also said in his speech that the whole sandbagging concept, basically. He also explained that.
Judge's
We're not
discretion.
allowed to say anything seriously.
Okay, cool. Okay. So let's move on to the first advantage, which is where most of the actual debate happens. First of all, let's talk about a lot of what they say on the first advantage that is just like wrong, and a lot of the scenarios that they're proposing that are empirically denied and also refuted by Nolan. First of all, we say that identity theft is a major problem, and they say that this is usually internet, and then they also talk about this whole backlog argument. However, they're ignoring our actual argument here. Obviously, we're not saying that all of these different internet companies, especially like small companies that are selling through the internet, not all of those problems are going to be solved. What we're specifically targeting here is like when somebody tries to use your identity to physically buy another product. They're ignoring our argument. They're just saying, oh, you don't solve this other thing. Yeah, sure, we don't solve this other thing. We solve what our argument is trying to solve. Next, they talk about how the average business and the average person won't have this technology, and then they extend to this as if we didn't refute it. They just say extend it, they didn't respond to it. We told you, Nolan told you, that this is becoming a desktop technology. It's not something that's going to be exclusive to these businesses, that's going to cost $1 bazillion and take way too long. It's something that is becoming a desktop technology, and that was conceded. They did not respond to that. Extend that. That means it's easy, basically. That's literally what Nolan is saying. Next, they say this whole argument on time frame, and this is like they try to format it as a disadvantage, but it's really like they reference back to it all over the place. So basically, their argument here is that it collapses the economy because everything takes way too long. First of all, extend what I just said. This is becoming a desktop technology. That means it's easy. Secondly, remember what I said in the first speech and what Nolan said. This policy is supplemented by other programs. If there is some scenario in which everything will collapse if you don't get this one dude's ID, then you will use the other supplemental identification.
Point of order, stop time. This argument that supplemental identification will be used on a national scale or on a large scale has never been brought up before in today's debate. The articulation has always been it will be ancillary.
Yeah, so I talked about supplementing, and then Nolan also talked about a similar argument, and then I'm specifically responding to the arguments that you made in the neck block about economic collapse. Those were not arguments that, like literally the only thing in the first speech about this was that it would take long. The whole economic collapse scenario, this is my first chance to respond. Okay. So Yeah, again, this is supplemental, it is a program that is supplemented by other things. So in this scenario, it will be supplemented by other forms of identification. That's something I said, that's something Nolan said. Third, extend all of the countries that use similar systems, all of the background information that we provide. This is empirically denied. The only example they bring is of India. However, India has a completely different system, and we explained that. That was conceded. That takes me to the DA, or sorry, not the DAs yet. And then the last thing they said in the block that if people, it'll kill people because they can't get to the ER on time in terms of like shock and stuff. However, they say earlier that emergency rooms treat all patients, which means that ERs are a non-issue. Like if somebody's going into shock and they're about to die, they will be treated. This argument doesn't apply here. So just to explain, if somebody has a prescription or needs a prescription, it doesn't matter if it takes 6 hours. It's better than them not being able to get it for months. And that's clearly what we're trying to solve here. On top of that, we talk about, and Nolan explains, and they concede, that identity theft, even if it does take a long time, even if you buy that argument, it doesn't matter because we can retroactively solve for this problem of identity theft where otherwise it wouldn't be. So yeah, Nolan said that you can catch identity theft afterwards, so we're still solving the problem. And then lastly, they say that we have to swab them and take DNA in the block, and they say that that's a bad thing. That's completely non-unique. The current systems also require similar processes, like getting your picture taken, or like giving your fingerprint, etc. Let's move on to the DAs, which is really like their only ground in this debate. However, what they're missing here is any response to every refutation that Nolan made in his second speech. First of all, civil liberties. Nolan made a bunch of non-unique arguments saying that this is true in any form of government identity. This is conceded. This means that they literally have no impact because this problem that they're talking about occurs in every world. And then he also talked about how India is completely different and cannot be compared. On the second disadvantage of hackers, extend everything Nolan says here. He gives 3 responses. 1, he says that they assume that this is vulnerable information and that it isn't, and he gives a social security example, and he also talks about hashes, about how like social securities are basically a passcode to a bunch of other very important stuff. But this information is not. It is solely an identifying factor. Next, this is non-unique in this, you have government databases that can be hacked. And third, this information is just identifying. All of these responses make it clear that they have absolutely no impact in the debate. Civil liberty violations happen no matter what. Hacking will happen no matter what, and also will happen a lot less under this program. And also, their whole backlog argument, I already have a bunch of responses. You should be voting on the risk of solvency here. If we prove that we have a chance of solving for the advantages, then you should be voting because they have no impact. Thank you.